Well, as we've been going through 2 Samuel, I've started pretty much every class with this picture kind of as the cover. And the reason for that is 2 Samuel is looking at David, as the king, whereas 1 Samuel is primarily looking at David as the guy who will be king. He's in this position where he'll eventually, he's anointed to be king, but he's waiting. And there's this process of him waiting on the timing of the Lord, waiting for the Lord to decide it's time for him to be king and not Saul. And even when he's given opportunities to usurp that power and take Saul out to become king, he doesn't do it. And as you look at the two stages of David's life, as we wind down 2 Samuel here, we really have two classes left, and this is the last class you have with me. So sigh of relief, keep it quiet yourself, but this is the last one you got with me. Next week will be with Steve Akers. But 2 Samuel is primarily this, what does power and success do to you? And it's interesting as you see David through the era of scraping and drive and pushing and longing for better days, you see a better version of David in that time period. He seems to have more focus when there's a Goliath to defeat or there is a Saul to run from. When the power comes and then the kingdom is established and stable for him, that's where we start seeing the difficulties. Well, it's interesting that what God ends up doing then is, since he struggles with stability, what does God do? He takes that stability away, right? He goes, oh, okay, well, if you struggle with the era of prosperity, if that's the time that you have the most difficulty, well, then let's just take that away and let's learn to deal with adversity again. And that's what we've seen. We've seen that sword not departing from his household. We've seen the consequences of sin, but also an era that brings out another side of David, but arguably one of the better sides of him. This side of David that understands mercy, that understands forgiveness, that is thankful for grace, is accepting of his punishment. He struggles with his boys, especially. I mean, I think that you see that pattern is that whether it be Amnon or Absalom or what we'll see here as we near the end, Adonijah, he struggles with his sons. He struggles to hold them to the standard that they ought to. But on the other hand, when he's fleeing Jerusalem and they bring the ark out, what's he say? Look, ark goes back, right? If God wants to bring me back to the ark, he'll do it. If not, then the ark should be here. I'm no longer God's anointed. That sounds like the old David. So the interesting thing seems to be that the pattern you see in David's life is that when David gets off track, there is a series of events that God will put into his life to bring the better David back to us. And I would argue that that's exactly what Hebrews is saying when it says that he is a father that disciplines us. Right? Here is David, and there's an era in his life where he's not the best version of David. Well, how does God get him back to being the kind of David he ought to be? Discipline. And I think there are some practical applications for us, too, that maybe not the best version of you. You may struggle with prosperity or ease, and sometimes God removing that is a gift, right? A spiritual gift. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The era of the judges, even the same thing, right? Bad things would happen, and so they would whine and complain, but then they would realize they needed to go to God, and God would send them to deliver, things would get better, and then they would forget and do it all over again. So yeah, that pattern is, prosperity is not always the gift we think it to be. That's all I'm saying, right? We tend to want it, but it's not always the best for us. So now as we go through this section, let's see if I can get this to go. Maybe it'll wake up and like me, maybe not. You guys mind up there hitting the slide for me? I don't have too many, but just perfect. Thank you. Okay, so this is the history that we've gone through, and then from there we're going to move to some other pieces of David's life after he's brought back from the revolt with Absalom. So we've gone through all of that. Absalom has been killed, and we've also seen that you go through chapter 21, and we're going to skip, by the way, chapter 22 and 23, and Steve Akers is actually going to go look at that with you. 2 Samuel 22 and 23 are Psalms of David, and you may or may not have noticed that Steve really likes the Psalms of David, and so we made an agreement he would do that as the closing out of the class. What we're going to do is look at some of the closing events here in his life. We'll look at chapter 24, so the final chapter of 2 Samuel, and then we'll also pivot a little bit into Kings, and because there's some overlap as Solomon becomes king. So chapter 24, and since the clicker isn't working, Bobby, you mind hitting the clicker for me? Just move it forward one slide. Thanks, guys. So 2 Samuel 24 begins with David making and taking a census. And we're not going to stay on this slide forever because that will do that perpetually to infinity. But David will ask Joab to take a census of the people. Why do I have this up here? Why is that animation there for David taking a census? Right? Okay, taxes. Okay, that might be one reason. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that one, but yes, okay, taxes, yeah. He's counting his wealth. His wealth, though, isn't really money like Scrooge McDuck, it's army. If you look at 2 Samuel 24, and you go down in verse 9, he tells Joab to take the census. Joab will do it after some duress, so we'll talk a little bit about that. It says, Joab gave the number of the registration of the people to the king, and there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword. And the men of Judah were 500,000 men. Who's the census of? It does not seem that it's of every person, but it is in fact instead of the army, of those who can fight. And so as we look at this, the census is David looking at his military force. Guys, can you move that slide one more time? Thank you. Perfect. Sorry for the inconvenience back there, guys. So eventually what's going to happen is God's going to be upset about this, and he's going to give him 3 choices. But before we look at those 3 choices, go to 2 Samuel. We got 2 Samuel 24 says, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. Okay, that's what the 2 Samuel account says. Turn over to 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 gives a different detail about this, the events that lead up to David asking for this census. It says, Satan stood up against Israel and moved David to number Israel. If you go to chapter 21, who's the impetus for this? Satan is the impetus. But chapter 24, it says the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. Here is what's happening is you have Israel is not the kind of nation that they ought to be, and also under David, they have had more opportunities to be blessed than they have ever previously. I mean, if you look at up to David, what life looked like for Israel, they were not nearly as blessed as they were under the Davidic reign. Now, under Solomon, they'll have even more blessings, but up until this point, David's as good as it gets, right? So they've had prosperity, they've had success, and Satan doesn't like that. And so there is and the adversary gets involved, and it reminds me very much of Judas when he betrayed Jesus. So, in some places it mentions and focuses on Judas being the one that betrayed Jesus. But in other places, who put the thought into his mind? In other accounts, it'll say Satan did it. Satan entered into him. What we have here is David contemplating this idea of how much of an army do I have? How powerful are we really? Now, that's one thing to think about, but the moment he actually goes, let's do a census. Now we have a problem. Why? Did you have something else before answering that question? Mm-hmm. Right. Why does it matter how big the army is, right? Right? That doesn't matter at all. I want you to turn back to Exodus with me. Exodus chapter 30. Exodus gives us a hint at why this census is problematic. In Exodus chapter 30, go down about verse 12. Start verse 11. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, then each one of them shall give a ransom for himself to the Lord when you number them, so that there will be no plague among them when you number them. So what's the end result? What is the consequence that they will face for this census? Jumping ahead, what happens? They get a plague. That sure sounds a lot like Exodus 30, doesn't it? In Exodus 30, it says when you take a census, there's a tax that needs to be paid and it's not called a tax, it's called a ransom. Think about what a ransom is. A ransom is a payment for something that you don't have but somebody else does. The point in Exodus 30 is if there is a time to take a census, and actually there are some times in the Old Testament where God called for a census. But it's God who calls for it, because whose people are they? They're God's people. So you pay a tax to God for that census because it's God's people, and you're supposed to remember that at all times. It seems that David's forgetting that. That seems to be the context here, is that David is forgetting that enough so, and we talked about this a little bit last week, Joab is not always the bad guy. In chapter 24 here, if you go back to 2 Samuel 24, when he says, go about now through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, register the people that I may know the number of the people, Joab is the one who says, now may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my Lord the king still see. But why does my Lord the king delight in this thing? Joab is the one who says, wait a second. Why do you want to do this, David? God will let him grow the size of the nation. That's not the problem. It's not that you don't want the nation to get bigger. Let it get bigger. But David, why do you want to number them? They're not your people. May the Lord be the one who increases the size of the nation. And so the problem here seems to be that David is, one, forgetting that the people aren't his people, which is a little bit harkening back to what got him in trouble in the first place, right? He got himself in trouble in the first place because during the time of kings, when the kings go out to war, he's like, I don't need to do it this time. A little bit of privilege there. And then two, when he sees Bathsheba, he takes her as if he has a right to take her as his, and she's not his. Right, so there's a little bit of this return to forgetting that these people do not belong to you, David. You are king because God has allowed you to be king. All your authority is delegated authority. And if God gives it to you, he can take it away from you. Yeah. Yes, I would agree. This is a step back, which is a good reminder to us that progress is not always linear in our spiritual growth, is it? Right? It's not always like better, 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 better. You'll have down seasons and valleys in that growth. Um, uh, because I agree, this is certainly a step back in that process. Now, his response to it will be a step forward. So it does kind of work both ways. But yes, this is definitely a step back. Anybody else have any comments or thoughts on that? Okay, so he does end up taking the census. And it's important for us to remember with events like this. So we look at the event of the census taking, and for us, it takes 9 verses. It's 9 verses for this to happen. But in reality, to count up all the tribes and all the warriors, right, Joab has to go, and there's a census-taking process, and this is going to take a lot of time. And so don't get in your mind that this was like a momentary whim of David, right? We can make that mistake sometimes because we read it quickly, we assume it happened quickly. This didn't happen quickly. He makes a decision, Joab gives him some pushback, he asks for it to happen, and then they have to go through this whole process of census taking. I mean, we have censuses that happen in America, and they are a huge undertaking to do. And so this entire process that goes from Dan to Beersheba, which is all the way from the north, all the way down to the south, numbering all of the various people, it takes this entire time. But then in verse 10 it says, now David's heart troubled him after he had numbered the people. Just pause for a second and understand that oftentimes this is exactly what happens. We get caught in the process of comparison, right? Because that's really what this is, right? If you're taking a census, how many people do I have versus some other king or other rulers in different times of history? Maybe I'm comparing the amount of land I have to how much existed during Saul's reign. Maybe it's compared to Tyre or some of the surrounding nations. You know, how big's Edom's army compared to ours? Whenever you start playing the comparison game with other people, even if you win the comparison, it's not as satisfying as what you think. It's never going to satisfy you to have more from this world. It's just never enough, right? And so here David, he gets what he wants. They give him the numbers, and so he's been waiting for this, right? We've gone through this whole process. We're going to count everybody up. Finally gets the numbers, and what happens to him? Now his gut starts to churn. Now he's troubled over it. Sure, I did the right thing, right? It comes to haunt him later, and oftentimes that, I think, is the case with us. Anybody have any thoughts or comments or anything like that? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wrong. Yeah. Yeah. No. Which is a classic Joab move, by the way. That's it's like his strength and his weakness. Right. Yeah, I know. Sometimes he gets himself in trouble by ignoring the kings, but in this one, it's like, this is the wrong call. And Joab is right. And yeah. Well, you're almost back to the Absalom thing when David says, whatever you do, save my son. And then Joab hears, he's hanging by his hair. Give me a sword. You know, and so he just ignores him. But yeah, you're right. Joab, he doesn't really want any part with this process at all. And so he doesn't even, I mean, it's funny. The thing that David wants, he actually doesn't even get. He doesn't even get an accurate census, right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. 1.3. Correct. Oh, that's an interesting comparison. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Him being troubled about it, like I had doubt. One option is that he had doubts, and so he's worried. We need to count up our fighting force because who knows whether or not we'll be strong enough. That's another approach. There could be worry in there. There could be pride in there. It could be a little bit of both, right? It could be any number of different things. So yeah, but that's an interesting compare our fighting force. Now, granted, military tactics a little bit different today, but I mean that's a sizable force that he has. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because we have no indication that he does pay the tax in this, right? I think it's fair for us to say that he doesn't do it God's way, which would also include that we're not taking up the census tax that would have been given to God in this process. So, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's another way that we're not doing what we ought to for the Lord. Yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Well, and that is exactly what David will end up saying, is he will end up agreeing with Joab, right? So Joab said, don't do it. David does it, but in the end, he is troubled. And in verse 10 there, he'll say, David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done, but now, O Lord, please take away the iniquity of your servant, for I have acted very foolishly. To David's credit, whenever David does something particularly dumb, what do we find him always doing, right? There's an ownership. Yeah, he just goes right to the Lord and he says, I have sinned. I did the wrong thing. Please forgive me. And so that character trait of David is seen throughout, and I think is an important one. And it also gives us some confidence that we can do some things that are really foolish. And there's always a pathway back to the Lord. There's this pathway of mercy that's available. Having said that, we also see the thing that we've always seen in David's life. God offers forgiveness, but there are still consequences, right? The earthly consequences don't disappear just because there is forgiveness, right? And so in this case, God gives him three options. You can be attacked by one of your enemies, there can be a famine, or there can be a disease or a plague. Sword, famine, pestilence. And that trio throughout the Bible, in fact, if you go to the minor prophets especially, well, not just the minor, but the major as well, go to the prophets, you will see that the tool that God uses to discipline nations are those three things: sword, famine, pestilence. That's it. Those are the things. So something for us to consider as people who live in God's world in a different nation, right? We don't live in Israel. We don't live in Edom or Egypt or Babylon. We live in America. But whenever you see sword, famine, or pestilence, I want you to get in your mind that these have always been tools God has used to try and get people to repent and to change. Anybody seen any pestilence in our lifetime? Right? I mean, we just went through a big stage of it. Now, was it America only that had the COVID thing? No, it was worldwide. Do I know the details of what God was doing with the pandemic? No. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not up here as a prophet saying, I know God did exactly this. But I will tell you, when I read my Bible, Whenever you see pestilence show up, God is working to try and get people to see something. And whenever war shows up, the sword, God is trying to get people to see something. And then whenever famine shows up, supply chain issues, right? God is trying to get people to see something. He takes stuff away, or He puts us in danger, right? So that we will turn to Him. Now, do people always turn to Him when sword, famine, and pestilence happen? No, they definitely don't. But oftentimes they will. 9/11, the sword, right? And again, I am not getting specific here in the sense of, do I know exactly what God was doing? No. But I want you, as you listen and watch or read the news and you read about sword, famine, and pestilence, I want you to read it with a Christian mindset. And what that means is we stop worrying so much and we go, you know what? God's working. I don't know what He's doing. But when I see sword, famine, and pestilence, I know He's working. And He's using these events to do something. And He knows what He's doing. Do I always know what He's doing? No. But He does. And so we can see throughout history that He's done that. And I think that's in your Old Testament in particular, so you can see the way that God interacts with nations. And so sword, famine, and pestilence, those are the three things offered to David. David chooses pestilence, the plague, because he says, I'd rather fall into the hands of the Lord. Now, the sword is falling into the hand of your enemy. Famine is relying on the kindness of your enemy or your neighbors. If you remember, when there was a worldwide famine back in the days of Joseph, what did everybody have to do for food? They had to go to Egypt, right? You had to find somebody who would help you out. Your success or your failure was dependent on whether or not the neighboring country that maybe didn't have your famine would support you and help you. And so David says, well, look, sword, I don't like that idea because I know human beings and they're not so great. Famine, I don't like that idea of needing to rely on my fellow man. So let me go to the one that is most directly God. God, give us a plague. And so that is, in fact, exactly what happens. So in verse 14, David says to the prophet that God had sent, I am in great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of the Lord, for His mercies are great, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. I might mention, just that response tells you there's some spiritual growth with David, right? What's David talking about with God at this stage of his life? Let me fall in the hand of the Lord because of His mercy, right? He's aware of the mercy of God in a way that young David wasn't, right? Young David knew the power and the justice of God, right? We go fight Goliath. If God is with me, who will stand against me? We'll win this battle. And it's a beautiful and powerful example of faith. But older David, who's had his teeth kicked in, understands, but God is merciful. He'll discipline me, but for my good. He'll love me at the end of it, right? And so let me fall into the hands of the Lord. Okay. Any comments, thoughts, questions, anything like that before we pivot to the next bit? Okay. You guys click the slide for me one more. Perfect. Thank you, Bobby. Okay. So we've looked at this map before. This is a map of Jerusalem at the time of David. And you don't have to worry about the details of it. I know a lot of the words are very hard to see, but as you look at the map, there above the city is this mount, this higher portion of land. That higher portion of land is where the temple will eventually be built. So later on, if you go to Jerusalem today, that empty area up there is where the Dome of the Rock is and where the temple used to be, the Temple Mount. And so at the time of David, there is, of course, no temple there, right? Because the temple has not been built. It is just this plot of land, and it is owned by a guy named Araunah, and he has his threshing floor up there. So he has his threshing floor where he will thresh out the wheat at that point. Well, David, when the pestilence hits, all these people die. In fact, you look at verse 15. The Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 men of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. There is an interesting kind of reminder here. What got us started in the first place? What were we doing? Yeah, we want to see how many fighting men we've got from Dan to Beersheba, and now what do we have? We just lost 70,000 of them. Right? By counting them and saying, I've got to know for me, you lost it. Right? If you Scrooge McDuck stuff, somehow God has a way of putting holes in your purses. That's what he'll say through the prophets, is that you be careful about that. And as that pestilence hits, at a certain point, it says in verse 16, when the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who destroyed the people, it is enough, now relax your hand. So now pause for a second. What has been killing the people? Look, an angel of the Lord, but we also, what have we been saying? What was the consequence? He had three choices. What did he choose? Yeah, I want the Lord to send pestilence because that'll be from him. So here we have, they're dying from pestilence. There's some sort of disease. There's some Ebola running through the camp, whatever it is. But as Zach put it, what's actually behind it? If you could pull back the curtain and look into the spiritual realm, it's not COVID-19. It's not Ebola. What's in the spiritual realm doing all of this? It's an angel. Right? There is a heavenly spiritual being that is involved in this process, and he is wiping people out, and he comes up to Jerusalem and is ready to lay waste to Jerusalem entirely, and God says, no, hold. God sets the borders by the way of plagues. Something to think about. And so, here as you look at it, there are two. What we're finding out is that there's two worlds, right? There's the physical world that you see where things happen, and then if you pull back the curtain, there's an angelic and a spiritual realm that's going on at the same time. And I think that's really important for us to remember, right? Because when we're going through physical hardship down here, sometimes we can feel like the spiritual realm doesn't care. That's not the case at all. When? Paul was what? Yeah, Paul went to the spiritual realm and was able to see some of those things. John got an insight into that. So there are seasons and times where God kind of pulls back the veil and lets some of his prophets see what's going on. And that then is given for us to realize it's still going on. That's all happening, right? And so David then is allowed to see this. And verse 17, it says, David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking down the people. So for whatever reason, the Lord decides throughout all of this pestilence, I'm going to let David see the angel. There does not seem to be any indication that other people are all seeing this angel, but David is allowed to see it, which, that would be quite a moment, wouldn't it? To realize the power and the might that was sent as a consequence for your choice. To look out your window and you see this angel that God has sent, and he is standing. And again, look at that map for a second. I'll hop up here for half a second. They won't be able to see it on live stream, but down here is all the people in the houses. That angel is hovering above that Temple Mount area. David's house is near the top of the city. It's actually it is at the top peak of the city. So he looks out and he sees this angel ready to destroy. What did David see last time you remember David looking at his house, from his house and looking? What did he see? He looked down and he saw Bathsheba. That's right. He looked down and he saw Bathsheba. This time he looks up and he sees an angel, sword at the ready. I think there's a contrast there given. And David recognizes it. And so David recognizes sin. He, again, speaks to the Lord when he sees the angel. What's his reaction? Go to the Lord. Speaks to the Lord. And then in verse 18, Gad came to David that day and he said to him, go up, erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So he goes up. He goes to Araunah. He says, I want to build this, I want to build an altar here. Let me buy the land. What does Araunah say? Yeah, you can have it. It's just yours. I'll give it to you. You're the king. I'll give you the land. No problem. And I think this is one of the most beautiful things that you'll ever see from David, because in verse 24, he says to Araunah, he says, no, but I will surely buy it from you for a price, for I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God, which cost me nothing. That'll preach, folks. That one sentence alone will preach. I will not offer sacrifice to the Lord that cost me nothing. He buys the land and then erects the altar there, and that becomes the location that will be the site that the Temple Mount is built on. Anybody else know any other big events that happened at that particular site throughout history? That's it. That's the same spot, right? Abraham, when he was prepared to sacrifice his son, that's where it was. So we have this continuing story of redemption from the Temple Mount, right? Go back to Abraham. Abraham is about to lose his son. He's going to sacrifice his son there, the son that he loves, right? Isaac. God stays his hand. And what are Abraham's words at that point? He says, God will provide. God will provide. Right? Because God provided a sacrifice, so Abraham didn't have to make it. Then you move forward and you look here at David, and there is a pestilence that came through because of the pride and the ego and the fear, whatever it was with David, right? Whatever led him to delight in doing this thing, this leads to a plague that is affecting people and just pouring over the land. And what stops it? David making a sacrifice to God that didn't cost him nothing, which means it cost him something, right? And so the angel's hand is stayed there. Then you have the temple that is built there. This is where God will be. And then what is it that is said about Jesus? When Jesus, the thing that he was accused of was blaspheming the temple, because he said, destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. God will provide. There is this message at this Temple Mount that you just see throughout the text. Is beautiful. The story of God redeeming. God saying, you blew it. It is your fault, but I will provide. I will cover costs that you can't handle paying. I will pay for sins that you caused and consequences that you deserve, I'll pay for. And even in David here, who we talk about David being a type of Jesus, right? Jesus will be the greater version, right? David is a shadow. David says, I'm not going to make a sacrifice that costs me nothing. Well, when Jesus comes and makes a sacrifice, what does it cost him? It costs him everything, right? Total cost. This is a beautiful picture that's just interwoven throughout the text, which is another reason, by the way, that we should have such confidence in the Bible. Because the Bible is written over the course of about 1,600 years. These stories are not written by the same writers, and yet they interweave together so perfectly, there must be only one author. It's one more reason for us to go, oh, this is a book only God could write. And so, down in verse 25, David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings, and thus the Lord was moved by prayer for the land, and the plague was held back from Israel. Okay, any comments or questions, or yes and then yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Mhm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, here, yeah, Uriah is one death, which is one death too many, right? But this is 70,000. And yet God is merciful to David there as well. So there's room for repentance for us as well. And a lot of times some of the worst damage we do is unintentional. David didn't wake up thinking I'm going to murder 70,000 people. That was something that came with the territory. Yeah, Corey? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He was a guy who had more awareness than most that there is a spiritual realm, and God's either with you or not, and that matters. So yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, well that's where 2 Samuel finishes. You can look at the very end of David's life by moving to 1 Kings. But what I would say is when you look at if you were to go and finish off David's life on your own and look at it, like I said, Steve's going to look at some of that psalm found earlier in 2 Samuel. 1 Kings 2 is a beautiful place, I think, to sum up the lessons that David learned about life, because in 1 Kings chapter 2, David there will give advice to Solomon on what does it take to be a good king. So after all of his life and all the things he'd done, and good and bad and in between, his advice to Solomon can be found in 1 Kings 2, and I think that really tells you the growth of David and his understanding that, look, you stick to the Lord, you follow him, be a man and follow the Lord, and you'll be just fine. So thank you all. I'll close down there. Steve will close out this quarter next week. Thanks.